The Six Nations Show on OTB Sports Radio.
With Vodafone, main sponsor of the Irish rugby team. We all belong to the team of us.
It's spinning! It's spinning!
Can you come on and talk about Ireland's attack shape? It's really exciting.
Go Ireland! I've never seen a team like Ireland before.
We all still think to this day that it's the right call and we're the ones out on the pitch.
OTB Sports Radio.
Yeah, and you're very welcome along to this St. Patrick's Day edition of the Six Nations Show as we preview the crescendo of the 2022 Championship. Delighted to be joined in studio by the Irish Independent's Rúaidhrí O'Connor. Rúaidhrí, thanks for braving the elements, the parade and the revellers and all that kind of stuff.
The elements are fine. It's fairly hairy out there though. Didn't have only a short commute to come, but it was different than normal. Town is bedlam out there, so I think this is the calmest place in Dublin right now. So
I think it's still the best case scenario compared to the last couple of St. Patrick's Days.
Definitely, absolutely. No, it's nice to see it. It's a bit of a shock to the system, but good preparation for Saturday, I guess. Hopefully there'll be plenty out and about on Saturday as well for the big game.
Absolutely, and there once was a time where beating England by a record margin in Twickenham would lead to a parade of similar proportions maybe, but the reaction has been interesting in its way that almost from the jump there's been certain people, Eddie O'Sullivan most notably, but several people, almost 50% I would say, falling down on the side of, there's possibly more shortcomings from that performance than you might typically take from a winning victory like that. Almost a week on, where do you fall down on it?
Yeah, I think that everything's contextualised by the fact that England had a man sent off after less than 90 seconds, and you would expect Ireland to manage. What I would look at is put yourself in the shoes of say New Zealand or South Africa and the company Ireland want to keep in World Rugby. What would they have done against England for 78.5 minutes against 14 men? You would expect them to handle it better, to not have a scrum go into complete meltdown against 7 forwards and a back, to not lose their way and have senior players giving away penalties along the way. And Ireland have reached a point now where we expect certain things of them. They've had a very good November. They've had quite a good Six Nations without maybe getting to that height. But they are one of the top teams in the world. And I would say that the way they handled certain elements of that game were not impressive. And yet they came good. They wrested momentum back. So they deserve a claim for that. But I think it's a mark of how highly we regard this Ireland team that we weren't as impressed with that win as we might have been in other eras. But the 14 men is a big deal. You can't take it out. I know people can point to examples of teams coping well with 14 men in different scenarios. Ireland and South Africa when they won for the first time in Cape Town when CJ Stanley was sent off. But that was the earliest red card in Six Nations history. It was a long time to be playing against 14 men, and there was just massive fault lines exposed, particularly in the scrum. I do think that it was different. There was a feeling leaving the stadium as well, or feeling within the stadium that really, I think it did come across on TV to some degree, but there was a panic about Ireland halfway through that second half. Now they got over it, and that's really, really impressive. But when you're leaving Twickenham with a record win and you also have so much to work on, it's a positive thing. The only issue being with that scrum in particular is there an obvious fix to it, and is there a personnel fix to it if Andrew Porter's not there, and I'm not sure there is. So that's what it was based on. It's great to win in Twickenham by that much and to come away with so much to work on, but you can't paper over the cracks that are there either. So I think that's why Saturday is really interesting to see, because I think Scotland have a good scrum, and they won't test Ireland in the same ways, but they will ask some questions of Ireland that we now have something to wonder about what Ireland will do in those scenarios.
Yeah, as you said there, the floor and ceiling of expectation for this Irish team, even from maybe this day last year or this week last year, were leading into the England game, serious questions being asked about the direction and about the coaching ticket in particular. So even in that year, things have changed. It's interesting you mentioned the panic, because I was going to ask you that. There was a sense watching it at least that, this is way too close for comfort, and England at least have the emotional pitch of the game in a way that Ireland don't. The closing 10 minutes where Ireland put it away, was that more a reflection on England fading, or are we giving Ireland credit for sticking to their principles and getting the job done?
They certainly did fade, but you got to look at little moments that wrested that momentum back. Ty Byrne turning over a line out, Andrew Conway's 50-22 kick, Andrew Conway's kick that landed in the in-goal area, and the pressure from the defensive line meant that they had to go for 50-22 when Ireland scored from that 50-22. Ireland suddenly put together phases and didn't force the offloads in the build up to Jack Conan's try. It was the only time they got above 10 phases in the entire game. So while And that helped England to get tired, but England were definitely tired. I mean, they took off Dombrandt, who'd only come on for Tom Curry early in the game. They could see, obviously, their GPS scores were starting to, the red lights were flashing all over the coach's box, but they could only take a couple of them off. That's a factor, but that's partly because Ireland kept the ball so well across the game. Even when things weren't going as well, Ireland tired them out. And so there's both. England were tired, but that's partly because they're 14 men, partly because of the way Ireland play. And Ireland finished very, very strong, and their bench came on and did their job. So that's to be applauded as well. Conor Murray played very well. Robbie Henshaw had a really big impact. Very unlucky not to start this Saturday. Conan was really good. Rob Herring just started carrying like I'd never seen Rob Herring carry before. Finlay Bealham gets his try. So that was impressive as well. They avoided dropping the ball, so they didn't have as many scrums, which was a big help as well. So, no, it's a bit of both. I think England were tiring, definitely, and that is a factor of the 14 men. But Ireland, you can't take that away from them. They finished stronger, and that's, that didn't, Paris was a little bit different to that. They we wondered after that whether the bench could contribute as much they did last weekend, and I think that's something that they can build on.
Yeah, and that psychological sway and the way they dealt with it possibly shows how mature they've become in that way, because it would have been very easy to reverse course, and it almost reminded me of the Irish soccer team in trying to play this more possession-based game, and you can almost sense the tension when the ball goes back to the goalkeeper kind of thing. And like Ireland, the reason the ball's on the ground more is because they're trying to keep possession more and play a little bit more expansively. So just before we get to the team news, Rory, which you mentioned, this is the last episode of this show, so we should probably take some stock of the tournament at large. And something that mentioned to Brian O'Driscoll during the week was that the value of the Six Nations as it stands currently, like I don't know to what extent you buy into the devalued notion, but you've got Eddie Jones, who rightly or wrongly one of the preeminent voices, possibly the preeminent voice in the game at the moment, devaluing it actively, I would say. Like, you're looking at back-to-back fifth place finishes for England possibly, and him saying it's all about the World Cup, it's all about the World Cup, which is fair enough because some people are myopic in that way. Italy, the whole how they've fallen off, and the South African dynamic, which was discussed at the midway point, like with all that in the mix, the Six Nations in isolation is still a very valuable tournament to win and should be looked at as such. Is that where you stand on it?
Yeah, I would be quite obsessed with the World Cup, and I make no apology for it. I think having been at the last two World Cups and staying beyond Ireland, I'd stayed for the semi-final and final, and having felt how irrelevant you feel being Ireland once the traditional quarter-final exit goes, I'm pretty... I think Ireland's obsession should be getting past the quarter-final of the World Cup, but I don't see why that would come at the expense of your Six Nations performances. This is a tournament definitely worth winning in its own right. Look at the crowds, look at it's box office. The viewing numbers. This is the time where people are listening to us on the radio. This is the time where people are reading what we write. This is the time where rugby has the attention of the nation, and that's across all Six Nations. It's on free-to-air TV. I don't understand how the RFU can allow Eddie Jones to diminish this tournament, because it's the bread and butter. It's the income stream for the unions. This is where the money comes from. The prize money is pretty good. The gate receipts for Twickenham are very important, and for them to go out and lose to Ireland and at home, it should be unacceptable to them in a tournament that, while you are always looking towards 2023, it's always there. But that doesn't mean you don't focus on the here and now as well. It's possible to do both. And yes, I would be kind of worried about certain Irish players' age profile, that they're fine now, but will they be fine in 18 months? And I would like to see, Carberry's had 2 games in this tournament, so I'm less concerned about that now. There are things you want to be building towards. I completely understand why a coach would pick their best team in the here and now and would want to win, but they should always have the long term. I think Ireland have a reasonable balance on it. There's a couple of positions where I'm a bit concerned, but you're right. The tournament is in an interesting place because CBC have bought into it. The private money has now come into it. South Africa are hovering there. I think they will inevitably come in at some stage, because that's where there's a lot of money to be made from that. I think they won't do it at the expense of the Italians. I think it might be an expanded tournament. It's in an interesting place, but it remains a very important piece of rugby real estate. I don't think it will be diminished. Eddie Jones will be gone in 2 years, and another England coach will come in and will probably respect the tournament more. He built his first World Cup cycle on a Grand Slam and a tournament win, and he seemed to care an awful lot more about it then. I think this might bite him in the ass in the end. It's a dangerous game to be playing, and he's undermining the confidence in his own team as well as he goes through these tournaments. Like, he can say that this doesn't matter as much, but if it is back-to-back fifth place finishes for the best resource team in the entire tournament, it's terrible.
And what degree is he reverse engineering this narrative? Like, if England were first in the Six Nations, he obviously wouldn't be speaking in this manner. But do you think he was ready to take short-term pain for long-term gain, or is that just the way it's played out?
It looks a bit muddled to me. You know, he's spoken. He speaks in such clear terms. You know, he said they got to this time last year, thought they had discovered something, and then Ireland, you know, beat them out the gate, and he decided he's going to jettison this. He's on basically his third iteration of his team. He got rid of the Vunipolas, a couple of others who've ended up actually coming back. So he's starting again and building a team. I would imagine he came into the Six Nations hoping that this team will be ready to actually perform, and now he's having to. It's coach speak. He's making, you know, he's trying to defend his players to say they're at the start of a journey. And Ireland traditionally have a bit of a habit of messing up World Cup cycles. They peaked in 2018 when actually 2019 was the time to do it. England got their timing right. Like they really produced in that 2019 Six Nations, particularly in that win over Ireland, and that was the launch pad. So maybe he's targeting the 2023 Six Nations. But you know, I wasn't aware of this phrase, but the jam tomorrow that I keep hearing on BBC podcasts, that they're all talking about it over there. Are English rugby fans, and are the RFU content to let Eddie Jones, who's gone after 2023 anyway, so if they crash out the pool stages, he's going to walk away regardless. Can they really afford to play a long game when the game in front of you is always the most important one? Like, there's a balance. It has to be a balance, and you know, losing to Scotland and Ireland, potentially losing to France is really poor. Like, that, if that was here, I think, you know, Andy Farrell will be under pressure, and Eddie Jones is so powerful in English rugby, it's quite hard to understand.
And you spoke about staging posts there and possibly the real estate of what a trophy represents. A secondary trophy obviously is the Triple Crown. Ireland's still in the mix for the whole championship obviously, but for Triple Crown point of view, it's not a lifetime ago that we were producing documentaries on winning Triple Crowns at home. So for this almost new look team, there's obviously some old faces, but like, winning is a habit, and to be picking up any kind of silverware should bode well. So would you be putting much stock on getting that job done this weekend? Yeah,
we almost got too good for Triple Crowns during the 2000s. Like 2004 was, like, I was in college. I was at the game against Scotland as a fan. It was a halcyon moment. Like, it was the first. It's all context, isn't it? I mean, Ireland hadn't won anything at Triple Crown since 1985. You know, for many of us, it was the first big moment, you know, that we could remember in our lifetimes of Ireland winning things. And then obviously they did it again in 06, 07, and then won the Grand Slam in 09. And suddenly it was about championships and Grand Slams. And you know, that's natural. I think for this team it would be a big step, and I think it would be churlish not to acknowledge it. I mean, there's not that many trophies available in the sport, and you know, if you get a chance to win one, you should celebrate it. You know, it's like, I think, like in football, say the League Cup. If you win the League Cup, you should celebrate it, because there's only three trophies available to win every year, and you know, Ireland, I think if they win the Triple Crown, they should enjoy it. They might even win the title. If they don't, they know that France are the better team than them on the day, and they missed their shot. But beating, especially in this era, beating Wales, Scotland and England in one season is an achievement. And you know, the tournament was once four nations. The Triple Crown predates the championship. It's a relic from rugby's traditions, but it's still there and it's still to be valued. And I think that, you know, it's an achievement in itself, and should rightly be celebrated. You know, I was reared on stories of 82 and 85, and then 2004 happened. Sure, our standards have gone up since, but still, I think it's a word, you know, it will be worthy of celebration. Yeah, particularly the last 2 years, I think we deserve to celebrate anything we can get. So
that's for sure.
Particularly those players, especially who've played in empty stadiums for 2 years, I think if they can win a trophy at home and there's a full house in the Aviva, I wouldn't begrudge them that moment. Some people would call it minimism or something like that, you know, but I think it's worthy of celebration.
Yeah, and speaking of the team that will be taking the field this weekend, there had been some suggestion that he might go with roughly the same team. Obviously, James Ryan notwithstanding, but Ian Henderson, Jack Conan, Mac Hansen, all in. Henderson in for Ryan, who Henderson obviously made that change early in the game at Twickenham. Hansen back on the right wing for Andrew Conway, potentially injury enforced.
Yeah, he had a knee injury.
Yeah, and then in terms of the back row, there's obviously been plenty of talk about balance there, and it seems like World Cup cycles every time this is the most stocked we've ever been at this position. But Jack Conan's back in, been good off the bench of late. I'd be interested to get your perspective on that in a moment. But in terms of the team at large, any surprises there?
No, well, the Hansen for Conway, they kept that one quiet. That injury, Conway was very good last weekend. It would have been no surprise if they'd kept him. The two big selection calls, obviously Henderson was always going to come in for Ryan, because Ryan suffered his concussion last weekend and is likely to be out for a little while now because of his history in that area. So really the two big calls in the team, well, maybe it was three. There was the centre. He stuck with Aki ahead of Henshaw, who was very good off the bench but hasn't had a lot of rugby. the front row, he's decided to go with them again. The word from the camp is that the ref got some decisions wrong, that it wasn't as bad as it looked, and that they can fix it. And they've now trusted Cian Healy, Dan Sheehan and Tadhg Furlong to get it right this weekend against a good Scottish front row. And then in the back row, it was whether O'Mahony would keep his place. I thought he was very quiet last weekend, and I think Conan, to me, that Leinster back row is better. It just works better, particularly the way Ireland play. And if O'Mahony doesn't have those big moments, games can pass him by. He was the top tackler, but I didn't notice him an awful lot in the stadium. On my watch back, he wasn't that prominent either, so I don't think he did enough to keep his place. And he's very good off the bench as well, so it's a bit of fresh legs as well, a week on from a fairly draining game. Team makes a lot of sense. I would have liked to see Gavin Coombs, Robert Balakoon get some involvement over the Six Nations, but with a title on the line, potentially you can understand why Andy Farrell's gone for a strong team. He's going to have 5 games, we think, in New Zealand this summer to try and get more people in. They're probably going to play the Maori twice. That's that long-term conversation, but for the here and now, he has introduced new faces. You got Kieran Treadwell, who's winning his 5th cap off the bench. That's another experience for him. But by and large, it was always going to be a strong team, his strongest team this weekend. So it does make an awful lot of sense.
And injuries in the front row obviously colour things in terms of strength and depth. But to what extent is sticking with the front row that struggled last week a reflection of maybe giving them that pat in the back and saying we back you to go again, or more so that they just don't have the depth to change things up?
Well, they definitely have. They had the option of, like, if you brought Dave Kilcoyne and Rob Herring into the team for Cian Healy and Dan Sheehan, you might have lost something, particularly with Sheehan in terms of you're playing the loose, because Sheehan is an exceptional player in the loose, but Herring is more of a strong set piece player and more experienced as well. So there was a case to be made for bringing Herring in for more solidity, but what Sheehan gives you in the loose is just so exciting and breaks teams open, and they have this playing identity that they're sticking to. So there may be sacrifice. They could go with the scrummagers or the set piece players, but they're going for the ball players, and they're maybe sacrificing or taking a risk there. With Healy, Kilcoyne and Healy quite close, I think, at this stage. Maybe they feel like Kilcoyne gives you more impact off the bench, but it's that layer beneath. It's really they don't, with Porter out, I don't think they can go beyond what's in the squad at the moment. They've brought Jeremy Loughlin in. He's not Munster's starting loosehead. You look across the provinces, there's really they've cast this net around. They've had Ed Byrne in there, they've had Eric O'Sullivan in there. They played Finlay Beelum against Georgia on the loosehead side of the scrum, but they need him on the tight head side. Porter's obviously moved across, and they've robbed Peter to play Paul to some degree there, although he's a better loosehead than he is. But that's where there's a bit of concern. If you were missing Kelleher and Porter, suddenly the cupboard looks quite bare. And we have great depth in other areas. You've mentioned the back row, the back three, the midfield. Really, really good depth. You wouldn't have much concern if you lost a few bodies there. But if you scratch the surface of that front row, I'd be quite worried. And that's a big, when we talk about the long term and World Cup cycles, that is a big worry, because there might be guys coming through academies, but they're really more 2027 options. For this 2023 cycle, we kind of have what we have. And I thought Keeney struggled with the pace of it last Saturday, and that was a big concern. Scrum wasn't going well, and he was behind the 8 ball when it came to the open play as well. He's 34, has an awful lot of rugby under his belt. He's traditionally been very fit, but I'd be a bit concerned about his longevity. So hopefully he answers his critics and comes out and has a great game on Saturday. But that is something I think we all need to watch out for.
And the back row, as we touched on there, perennially interesting. Like I don't want to be annoying the Six Nations loyalists, but I wonder if we got to a World Cup quarter final, what if this was the back row that would be playing, because Caelan Doris is possibly at a level where he's such a good ball player, as you said, that he'd possibly lose something by playing him at 6. So having him at 8 in 2 years' time might be the premier option. I don't know what you think about that.
I think, well, the one thing with this back row is that age profile they're all going to be around in 2023. So you have, you're not worried really about any of them falling off a cliff, in terms of their age. So the way they're managing it at the moment maybe augurs for what they'll do at the World Cup. So O'Mahony comes in as a tactical call, because England have a very strong line out with a really strong jumping 6 who's more of a second row, so you go horses for courses. Scotland have a 6 and a 7 who are more ball players, groundhogs, so you bring Conan back in. You don't necessarily need what O'Mahony brings. You've got Coombs outside the picture, but I think over the next 18 months he will come into the picture more. You've Timoney, who's a really good player as well. I like Doris at 6 and 8, to be honest. You may lose some of what Doris has to offer at 6, but you also gain what Jack Conan has to offer, and he's such a smart footballer. Listening to Alex Corbusiero, who's on the Left Wing podcast and Independent that I earlier in the week, he was talking about how Jack Conan is the better scrummager, which is something we don't often think about, the way a number 8 locks a scrum together, particularly when Ireland's second rows are lighter than most other international teams. Conan was actually heavily criticised after the Leinster Saracens game in 2020. He's obviously learned from that experience. He's gone on a Lions tour, so that's interesting that he has that string that we maybe don't appreciate when it comes to a number 8. Doris has loads of time to pick that up and to learn from his Leinster teammate. This is the back row Leinster pick. I don't think O'Mahony's doing enough to break it up, but there are cases to be made in certain games where he is a very good option. Say you're playing South Africa in a pool game, they have Peter Steph Toit at 6. Well, maybe you have to put O'Mahony there because you need to go after your lineup. Maybe you move Ty Byrne back. I still think that's a massive option for Ireland, but I really like, in terms of the way Ireland play, in terms of having ball carrying options across your in every department of your forwards, passers, players who can hang out wide, who can do the kind of who can open defences up. I think Conan, flanked by Van der Fleer and Doris, is really, really impressive. It's one of the best back rows in the world, and that's why I think he's gone for it. And I think that's the way to go. I think this suits Ireland. The way they play, this back row suits them. Sure, you're bringing O'Mahony at certain points, but O'Mahony's very experienced, comes off the bench and does something pretty impressive as well at times. And
Van der Fleer, possibly my own fault, is the odd one out in the 3 there that I named, because he's never been eye-catching, but top tackler for the team this year, and also his ball playing, I don't know if it's come on leaps and bounds, but it's more prominent, I would say, in the last few months and possibly year than it had been previously.
I haven't checked the stats since the England game, but before the England game he was actually the most first arrivals of any Ireland player at ruck time, so he's taken on a role that's normally held by second rows. So they've obviously identified something in his game that he can, his work rate is unbelievable. So he's his tackle count's huge, his carrying's really good, but he's also getting to the ball first. And Ireland have the quickest ball in this tournament. Their ruck success is really good. So that's another layer to his game that probably goes under the radar because we don't necessarily notice those ruck involvements. I was amazed when he got a new Leinster contract and wasn't handed a central contract recently. I mean, he's become a pivotal figure for Ireland over the last year or two. I was one of these people who was waiting for Dan Levy to come back. I love Levy. I think Levy is just, it's such a loss to Irish rugby. The fact that he was a generational number 7 and was so dominant in 18 and has been so destroyed by injuries. It's such a sad story that he hasn't been able to kick on. And I probably underappreciated what Van der Fleer had to offer as I willed Levy back to fitness. And I think in 19 he possibly was a bit underpowered. But right now he's top of his game, and he is... he's a very likeable guy, Josh Van der Fleer. He's very much a team man. He's so industrious, and he puts the team before himself all the time. I think Farrell and all the coaches love him. He's very unlucky not to be in line last year. I mean, he just, again, I think he falls between the cracks when it comes to standout performances, but he's such an important player for Ireland. And it's not a conversation. That's why we don't talk about him, because it's just he's there. He's number 7. He starts for Ireland when he's fit at the moment, and there's no one. Timothy's playing well, but there's no debate really that Josh Van der Fleer doesn't start for Ireland at the moment.
And last word just on the scrum, because it was possibly the top talking point off the back of it, and I don't know to what extent we can frame what was in the referee's mind, but human nature would suggest that after swaying the game in one way massively in the first minute, even though it was a clear-cut red card, that second nature might be to try and even it up where possible. And Nigel Owens made the point that there was more parity in the scrum than there might normally have been. We've talked about the front row, but the scrummaging has been something that was on Joe Schmidt's mind going into the World Cup in 2019, that the selections he made, leaving Devin Toner out, for example, to that end. This isn't as fixable as bad handling errors were at the last weekend, and discipline where Sexton going in front of the kicker, all this kind of stuff. Scrummaging is not something we can just fix ahead of this game, and possibly not something we can fix going into the World Cup either.
Yeah, and you wouldn't be overly concerned. Scotland have a good front row, a good scrum. Scoman in particular is a very, very good operator. They've got WP Nell coming off the bench, so they have good operators who will have watched last week and will be licking their lips to get stuck into Ireland. There's been a succession of experts coming into the studio all week to talk about it, and I wouldn't profess to be. I played a bit of front row at a very low level, but I wouldn't profess to understand the exact mechanics of it. But this is something that you would be worried about when it comes to a game against England, France or South Africa down the road. South Africa coming in November, maybe even New Zealand, probably not to the same extent, but those destructive scrums. Think back to the World Cup final, think back to the Lions series when South Africa got on top of the Lions. Think back to Saracens Leinster in 2020 when Saracens were able to kick to the corner, win them all, kick to the corner. earn a scrum. They were just completely dominant in those exchanges. La Rochelle, Leinster. There's just a bit of a trend there that comes up every so often when we come up against a certain profile of team, and it will be an underlying concern for Ireland going to this World Cup, where they play South Africa in the pool, and they probably will play France or New Zealand in the quarter final. They will have to take on teams with this level of power along the way, and they need to learn an awful lot from last Saturday. Yes, the referee may have got some decisions wrong, but he rewarded dominance. He's a French official. He's widely regarded as one of the best scrummaging referees in the world, and for all that Ireland are upset about his performance, I think there was a lot of legitimacy to the way England got on top, and there were technical things that Ireland were doing wrong, and what I fear for is that they weren't able to figure it out themselves, that they were looking to the ref for to solve their problems, when, as Keith Wood said, it was Mike Ross was saying, we need to cheat more. They need to figure that stuff out. It's thinking on the go. You cannot rely on the referee to sort out your problems, and for all that you can send a missive into World Rugby on the Monday, if that's a World Cup quarter final, it's too late. If that's after this Saturday and you've lost out in your Triple Crown and your championship, it's too late to figure those things out. So they got to figure that stuff out in themselves. It's great that the warning came in a record win. That's the good thing. And they have they've good personnel in there. John Fogarty's very highly regarded. They have good players, very experienced players, and they've got to learn from it. And that's what I'm looking forward to seeing on Saturday, is how they handle that battle. Wayne Barnes will referee it differently to Matthew Raynell. There is a style thing, and if you're playing France in the quarter final, the one good thing is you want to have a French ref, but the French will target it. They have that's where, look at the top 14 every week. The scrum is the main battleground. That is something Ireland need to be right on top of, and their attacking game is so good. It would be such a shame to have it undermined by a malfunctioning set piece at the highest level. Bit of time to fix it now, but it's going to be from within this group of players. Apart from Andrew Porter and Ronan Keller are coming back, obviously, there's no knights in shining armour who are coming in. You can't go and sign a project player unless there's some Irish qualified guy that we haven't heard of in South Africa that they've got an eye on. It's going to come from within this player group, so it's going to be a technical fix, and they've got to figure out that on their own. Yeah, you're listening to the Six Nations show here on Off the Ball. Rugby here is with Vodafone, main sponsor of the Irish rugby team. We all belong to the team of us. One last point on Ireland broadly before we move on to the Scotland side of things. The whole term finishers, I can't remember which English club pioneered this, but it was kind of lampooned a little bit, that finishing with your stronger team, but it's certainly true. And of this Ireland team, I thought it was kind of evidenced by Conor Murray's game intelligence off the bench, and it's not a role he would have been comfortable with. Certainly Lions captain not so long ago, however briefly, but seemed to relish it a little bit when he came on off the bench and steered Ireland very impressively, I thought. And there was probably previous generations where you'd like to see a Gibson Park type player come on to speed things up, but it was actually important that Murray came and slowed things down. Knew Ireland need to go through more phases possibly to break England open, and that's what they did. And Murray did it, and possibly O'Mahony, as you're alluding to, might be more comfortable in that position. So we've actually built depth in that department that we possibly didn't have before. Yeah, it's all context, isn't it? I mean, if you come on at 15-all, the job is different than if you come on at 10 points down. And I would worry about O'Mahony and Murray coming in if you're chasing a game from that far back. But it's hard to do anyway. It's not easy. But you look at Craig Casey and you think he's probably able to do what Gibson Park does. He's got he matches up to Gibson Park better. But if you want to change the way you're playing, if you want to hold out, if you're 15 points up and you want to manage the last 15 minutes of a game, Murray and O'Mahony in particular are kind of perfect for that. They've got such experience. Ireland's bench is really good in Twickenham. As we said earlier, they England were flagging, but Murray, I thought, did bring a calm assurance and a reminder of what a quality player he can be. His standards probably have dropped in the last 2-3 years, and that's, Andy Farrell has spotted that, and he's taken him out of the team, and that's got to hurt. I mean, all these lads have a certain amount of pride, a certain amount of ego, and if you've been Ireland's starting number 9 since 2011 and you're suddenly on the bench, that's got to hurt. And maybe it takes a while to adapt to that role, but the best way to get back into the team is to perform, and he did that last weekend. I think he still, I thought he kept the tempo quite high. 1 or 2 passes still dropped off. He still needs to adapt more to the way Ireland are playing to challenge Gibson Park for that number 9 jersey again. It was going to take a bit of reinvention for him to do that, but if Andy Farrell, the players seem to love playing in the setup, and they seem to be able to accept being dropped out of the starting team. They seem to be able to come in and park their egos and perform off the bench. So maybe this is his role for the rest of the cycle, and he will get a couple of starts here and there, but Gibson Park's the starter. I can't imagine he'd be content with that. I it was too cosy before. Under Joe Schmidt, everyone was guaranteed a place. Now players are finding themselves out of the team and they have to perform to get back in, and that's a much more healthy place. That's far great. The competition has to mean something, and if Gibson Park's training better, then he's got to get in. So it's interesting to see how Murray develops. It's a real it's a humbling experience for him, but the way he reacted in Twickenham was pretty encouraging.
Someone who might not react as well is Finn Russell, Rory, and Blair Kinghorn has come in at out half, and we spoke before the show just off air that possibly he had been pegged as more of a utility back or like full back even, but more and more trusted in the number 10 shirt, and Gregor Townsend giving him his head in a game which is not meaningless for Scotland, but if they're going to try something out in this tournament they have to do it now. That's what you would look at on the surface, but we know Townsend and Russell have a bit of previous. Would you be reading much into the latter point, or is this more a case that Finn Russell's not playing very well at the moment?
That's probably it. They seem to have parked their previous difficulties. Maybe that's eroded some of Townsend's faith in Finn Russell, but it's more, it's that tracking back in the France game that was so widely publicised in the build up to the try. He was quite good against England. He was very important to the way they beat England, those double cross kicks and the tactical stuff. But that was deep in the game. He can still come on and affect this game. But Kinghorn's an interesting one. I mean, a lot of stock has been put in a performance he gave for Edinburgh against Connacht a couple of weeks ago. And, he was very good that day. But that was a URC game during an international window. This is a massive step up, and it's hard to believe that a player who's played so much in the back three during his professional career, having been at 10 at underage level, can pivot so quickly with such. I mean, he's played a bit there this year, but whether he's able to come in and control an international game at the Aviva Stadium against Ireland, that's a big ask. Maybe I'm completely underestimating him. These days, he's very quick. He's a very skillful player, but he's up against Johnny Sexton, who's winning his 105th cap, all of which were at 10. He's very clearly defined number 10. It's probably a flaw in the Scottish system where they only have two professional teams. Like, if you think about games against Ireland the last couple of years, Adam Hastings has been 10, Jakob van der Velde has been 10. Hastings is in there, but he's not getting selected. He seems to be, I don't know, is he paying the price for leaving the Scottish system? There's a bit of politics there maybe, but yeah, they have a good team. He's alongside Ali Price behind a good pack, and he's a very good player. It's an unknown really. I know he has played a bit of international rugby there, but not much, and it's a bit of a sink or swim. And Scotland are a bit scratching around at this stage. When Ireland have a quite clearly defined plan, that 18 months out from a World Cup, Scotland seem to be coming off their peak last year and searching for answers when you really should be finding solutions. And
from a Townsend point of view, he's in an interesting point where they are quite close to Six Nations or to a World Cup, which the cycle has obviously flown by for a whole host of reasons, but it's a bit of a gamble, I would say, to move so drastically in this direction with someone who's not exactly tried and trusted. And I just wonder, is there any sense that he might not make it to the France World Cup next year? There's not really. I don't, picking up bits of Scottish media and stuff, I don't get that sense that he's under any particular pressure. I think he was under pressure after the 2019 World Cup, and understandably so. I mean, they had a terrible tournament, and he's changed an awful lot since then. It seemed like those changes, they backed him, and having been backed, he produced two reasonably good seasons, some very good results. Going away from home behind closed doors seemed to suit them. They got big wins in Twickenham, they won in Paris, they've won in Wales, I think it was in Parky Scarlets rather than Cardiff. So they've had big one-off wins, and they beat England again this year. And remember the talk after that was they were going to win the Grand Slam, and again it's kind of fallen off the tracks. They're a little bit like Ireland of maybe 15 years ago, where they could pick up a big win and then not back it up. But their defence under Steve Tandy, who got the Lions gig on the back of his work last year, is nowhere near what it was last season, the year before. Maybe teams have figured it out. Maybe the players have grown tired of the voice. I don't know, but there's definitely not the same level of intensity, the same level of line speed that was there before. He's searching around for an out half. I think he's safe, but you'll be less worried about Ireland meeting Scotland in a pool game next year, which could be the defining game of that tournament for Ireland. If you think South Africa are probably going to beat both teams, you're less worried about playing Scotland in 2023 now than you would have been 12 months ago, when they seem to be a much stronger outfit. Plenty of time to get it right. I think he'll be allowed. I think it's hard to see any coach losing their job between now and 2023 at this stage. I mean, Eddie Jones probably should, but he's not going to.
But certainly they're trending downwards at the moment, and kind of scratching around looking for answers. If you look at the team, it's a very settled enough team. Now, Darge has come into the picture this year. They're playing Kinghorn, but everyone else there's no unfamiliar faces. It's not like he's reinventing the wheel there, and it's just form has fallen off a cliff a bit, which must be a massive worry for Scottish rugby fans.
Yeah, that parallel struck me as well to a bygone era of Irish rugby where, the build up to a certain game, you can feel the levels in the nation almost rise, and they're going to get to the pitch of it, and Ireland can still produce those performances against the likes of England even when they're not playing well. But it's the other games where winning almost becomes a habit for a team, and Scotland should be contemporaries of Ireland really in terms of resources if all things were equal, but they haven't got to that level yet. And yet, given the circumstances and the fact that they've been written off in many quarters, this could potentially be type of game where they raise their levels. And Johnny Sexton and Cian Healy were making the point, Healy in particular, about the time Dan Parks kicked that goal at Croke Park, and Sexton saying that if Ireland produced a performance like they did against England, it might not be enough against Scotland. So this could be a banana skin for Ireland.
You look at the 15 names on the Scottish team sheet, they're very, very good. They're good players. They have, as I say, in the last 2 years, they've gone to Paris, London and Clonetly and won away from home against France, England and Wales, which traditionally they weren't able to do. Now, they were behind closed doors, but I think you write the Scottish team off at your peril. I think like they're not a walkover by any means. At the same time, they must be low on confidence after the window that they've had. That to start so strongly against England and then get hockeyed by France and beaten by a Wales team that was still it was an emotional performance in Cardiff, but they didn't play particularly Wales that day, and Scotland, a better team than Scotland, would have picked them off. But with the pressure off, they're quite dangerous. I think this is when expectations are low. Like, they don't play well when expectations are high. They are like the classic Irish underdog story of 15, 20 years ago. And there's definitely, if Ireland get ahead of themselves, which I get the sense they don't, like, for all that we were critical of Ireland after last weekend, the immediate post-match reaction was pretty self-aware. I was in Kobe for the Ireland Russia game in Japan during the World Cup, where they all told us they played really well, and I was like, we were all thought they were deluded. There was real worry that they and if they believed that, they were in trouble, and they were in trouble. Whereas this time around, they played badly against England. They won by record score. They didn't allow the record score to paper over the cracks. They were all very honest about where they were, and I think that's encouraging, because they've been in there all week trying to right wrongs. They're not believing, they're not drinking the Kool-Aid, as Eddie O'Sullivan would say. So if they can put that all together into a performance, if they play to their strengths, they'll beat the Scottish team. If they're off it, if they're starting to think about, like, I think that 2010 game, it was the last game at Croke Park. They were going to win a Triple Crown, and they'd all brought their intercounty GA jerseys to wear as kind of a sign off from Croke Park. They brought in Mumford & Sons the night before for a concert, I think.
I was reading something about Healy saying that perhaps the preparation the night before wasn't at its utmost.
I don't think they've brought in an international band since. But yeah, like that. It sounds like they just got it wrong that week, and you can be sure that even having Healy, Sexton, Paul O'Connell in the setup will guard against that. But yeah, if they're off it, Scotland can beat them, and Scotland could just come out and just shackles off, play really, really well, and target the Irish scrum. And because they heard the ref was bad last week, they think they're okay, and they're not. I don't see it personally, but it's not beyond the realms by any means, and that's what makes it interesting. I mean, Ireland have to go. They're expected to win. They have to go and win, and this is what, at the moment, separates Ireland from Scotland, is that they win the games they're expected to win. The one game they've lost this season is the one they weren't. So I like it. It's a fascinating matchup. Ireland should be better than them. They should be stronger. They've generally had the edge in this fixture for the last 12 years since that game, apart from the time the bus was late in Murrayfield. So yeah, I think they're going to win it, but I think you're right. I wouldn't write off a Scottish victory just yet.
The main thing from that, you have me hankering for a return to Kobe. I was there as a fan, and the game was way down the highlights list of that's an unbelievable city.
I just want to go back to Japan. What an amazing place.
Unreal. We should touch on the other games before we wrap up here, Rory. And France against England, we'll be keeping a keen eye, hopefully, on how that plays out. And much is made of the emotional aptitude of that England team, and the celebrating like the Waterford hurlers after every little victory on the pitch. Like, they might be able to match France physically in those departments as well, and it could be an arm wrestle in certain quarters. But the depth of difference in terms of flair and ability at the moment between these two teams is so vast that on a dry day like it's forecasted to be, like, France should win this comfortably. No.
Well, I think France have felt the weight of pressure of a first Grand Slam since 2010, and you could see it out in Cardiff last weekend. Even against Ireland, they probably should have won that game more comfortably. and they have slipped up. This team haven't put it to bed. You know, they lost to Scotland in the last game last year when they could have won the championship. So there is a chance, you know, and England, for all of their flaws and the fact that their attack seems completely muddled, there was a sense coming into last week's game that they were a little bit like Ireland were this time last year, and Ireland clicked in the final game of the tournament. They've changed it up a little bit. They brought Furbank back in at 15. They've moved Stewart onto the wing. I don't know, is that moving the deck chairs? Like, they can match France physically up front. They're the only team in the tournament who really can match the horses that France have. They've got the power and the size to be able to do so. And they have a very good set piece, so they can if they can get dominance in that area, and if they can disrupt at the breakdown and put DuPont under pressure, then, like, of course they can go and win this game. But you just struggle to see where the tries are going to come from. They've only scored, they've scored a very small amount compared to what you would expect from them in this tournament. They've relied on Marcus Smith's boot throughout, and if they're relying on Marcus Smith in Paris, I think they're going to be just kicking his goals in Paris. They're going to be in trouble. But if Ireland win and put the pressure on, and France come into this game knowing that they need to win to secure it, and things, you know, England get on top early and the crowd turns a little bit, you know, that's going to make life interesting for them. But teams traditionally, I know there have been kind of upsets, you know, Ireland have stopped England winning Grand Slam a couple of times and stuff, but teams often explode when this opportunity arrives, that they've got to the finish line. Now it's time to get over it. And I can see this French team, there's a sense of destiny about them, and with the World Cup coming next year at home, 9 o'clock local time kickoff, there's going to be huge backing for them, and they are a better team than England, you know, really they are. But England have, again, like Scotland, England have there's no pressure really on England. I know they're probably self-imposed pressure based on, you know, they don't want to finish fifth again, but, you know, there's not like they have anything on the line. You know, they could do it, but it's just hard to see. And like last week must have taken a lot out of them as well.
Yeah, and talking about the value of the Six Nations, having France vibrant again has certainly redoubled appreciation of how important they are as a cog of the whole thing. And talking again about World Cup cycles, like, they've been putting their eggs in this 2023 basket for a long time out, so it does feel like this is actually staging post of a Triple Crown for Ireland, but winning this Grand Slam for France would be massive as a marker for winning the World Cup. Yeah,
it was the same point that Ireland won in the last World Cup cycle. It didn't work out too well for us. But I mean, the way Galtier has basically just scrapped the team and built it from scratch in 2020, like they're just on this upward curve, and they're like, a Grand Slam is just, it seems like the perfect trajectory. You know, that Ireland team was pretty much at the end of the road in 2018, you know, on reflection, whereas Galtier's team, like age profile wise, if they win a Grand Slam, it's just another notch in their belt as they go towards that World Cup, and they're looking they look like the best team in the world right now. South Africans would disagree, but you know, this would cement that sense that they're on the right track. And look, they've got such quality. They're great to watch. They've got every kind of string to a rugby team's bow that you would want. You know, they have a powerful pack. They have an incredible number 9. They have a very good number 10. They've got brilliant centres, exciting back 3 players, a murderous back row. Like, they're just brilliant, and have a bench that comes on and affects games. They're ticking every box, so it's just winning that title, putting it all together, and you wouldn't begrudge it to them. They've played brilliant rugby, and they've earned what they've gotten. So part of me would like, obviously as an Irish person, you want to see Ireland win it, but like, part of me wants to see this. You know, you're right, this tournament, you know, it's a bit scary when they get good, but this tournament kind of needs England and France to be really strong, and it's good to see.
And finally, the fact that I've left it last for like a cursory final question on Wales kind of sums up that their defence of the Six Nations hasn't been overly stellar.
Yeah, and they've gone back to Alan Wynne-Jones this weekend for his, I think it's his 150th cap, which is an incredible achievement, but it just speaks volumes as to where they are at the moment. Now it looks like he's coming back with the view to 2023 himself, that this is the kind of staging post for his last hurrah for Wales, but it hasn't gone well. I mean, Dublin was a disaster. They've probably weathered the storm since. You know, they were quite good against France last weekend. You know, they won't be happy with the results, but they've kind of, from the crisis point that they started with, they've kind of grown into the tournament to a degree. They'll hammer Italy, finish off on relative high. Whether they're going to be a force next year, you know, like with the regions in trouble and everything, you know, that's a conversation for another day. But like, the sad part is, or the kind of disappointing part is that just you can't. It's not a contest. It's a complete afterthought. And most people, I think, will, you know, if you're going to spend, you know, you've got a choice of spending 4 hours in front of the TV watching rugby, or 6 hours in front of the TV watching rugby, you might keep an eye on Wales Italy, but you're not going to be compelled to watch it. And that's one area where the Six Nations certainly has to, you know, focus in on, because the rest of the tournament is so good. These Italian games are serving no purpose, and I'm not saying throw them out, but we've got to see them get better, because it's a bit like, they add very little to the tournament at the moment apart from a nice trip.
That's it. And that's another Six Nations show in the books. Cheers, Rory.
Thanks, Ron.
And a reminder, Rugby and Off the Ball is with thanks to Vodafone, main sponsor of the Irish rugby team. We all belong to the team of us.
The Six Nations Show on OTB Sports Radio.
With Vodafone, main sponsor of the Irish rugby team. We all belong to the team of us.
It's spinning! It's spinning!
Can you come on and talk about Ireland's attack shape? It's really exciting.
I've never seen a team like Ireland before.
We all still think to this day that it's the right call and we're the ones out on the pitch.
OTB Sports Radio.